Before Aaron could even react, Dale took a deep breath and plunged into the flooded hallway. Aaron stood in shock, knowing there would likely be 2 drownings in the next couple of minutes. Heidi, and then Dale in a vain rescue attempt. Could it really be their time to die? As panic seized his heart, Aaron put both hands in the swirling water and said, "By the power of the Melchizedek priesthood I hold, and in the name of Jesus Christ, I command this water to depart this basement." Hello, and welcome to WordWise. I'm your host, Kit, and before I say anything else, I want to thank Lauren of Hidden True Crime for featuring my Doug's Dilemma video in hers. That was so nice of her, and I'm honored that someone who inspired me to take the plunge on YouTube is now watching my videos. That's amazing. For all the new subs and people who are giving this channel a try thanks to Lauren's recommendation, welcome. I'm a writer and editor who started reading Chad Daybell and felt like she had something to say about his dreadful, dreadful novels. I have a Daybell playlist with all the videos in order, so please check that out. Today we'll be discussing Chad's 11th novel, Martial Law, the second book in Chad's last series, Times of Turmoil. When we left off, the US government had made a series of bizarre and contradictory moves that may or may not have been intended to destroy society. The faithful Mormons have gathered to the fancy white camps in the mountains, but all of the major characters have found excuses to remain out in the world. Maintenance missionary Nathan Foster has left his 12-year-old sister Denise with Carol and Aaron Shaw, his would-be girlfriend Marie's parents, and gone to Chicago to be reunited with Marie after she got humbled when the Occupy Wall Street movement inspired complete anarchy. Let's start with Martial Law's author's note. After pointing to various events that he feels indicate that 2013 was the beginning of the end times, and then a long quote from Brigham Young, Chad writes, "As you know, the first volume in this series, Evading Babylon, ended with a cliffhanger. One reviewer called it a brutal trick. I apologize for that, but I felt I needed to stop the book at that point. I didn't quite understand why until I read the book Visions of Glory, which was published a few months later. In that book, a man who goes by the pseudonym Spencer shares what he saw during several near-death experiences. The part of the book that jumped out at me was Spencer's account of a future earthquake striking the Wasatch Front. I've actually included that earthquake in my previous Standing in Holy Places series, but Spencer gave additional information and insights about the earthquake, and I've been able to incorporate many of those descriptions into this book. This is relevant to something I brought up last week in my first short. There are differences in the timeline of the End of Days events between each of Chad's 3 series, the Emma trilogy, Standing in Holy Places, and Times of Turmoil, even though they each take place in the Chad Daybell Doomsday Universe, or the CDDU, and supposedly all of these series focus on the same events. After the Emma trilogy, Chad read a lot of Mormon books of end-time prophecies, so he changed the CDDU timeline to match them when he wrote Standing in Holy Places. But when he wrote Times of Turmoil, he changed the timeline to match the one in Visions of Glory. This is surprising because Visions of Glory came out 6 months after the first book in the Times of Turmoil series, which makes me wonder exactly when Chad and Julie Rowe began meeting with Tom Harrison. Did Chad have an advance copy of Visions of Glory? Was he in touch with John Pontius? If anybody knows anything about Chad and Tom, please email me at wordwisevideos@gmail.com. The Spencer Chad refers to in the author's note is, of course, Tom Harrison. It sounds like what Chad is saying is that Tom Harrison ripped off the idea for the earthquake from Standing in Holy Places, so then Chad helped himself to the details of the earthquake from Visions of Glory and put them in this book. And thanks to Megan Connor's recent revelations, I think it's a safe bet that this was all somehow connected to the Church of the Firstborn. Chad also takes a moment to plug Suzanne Freeman's book, The Spirit of Liberty, without, of course, mentioning that he published it. Thus ends the author's note. As he did in the last book, Chad includes a section titled The Turmoil Deepens. It's just a summary of the state of affairs at the end of the first book with a few conservative talking points thrown in. Chapter 1. The morning after their happy reunion, Marie and Nathan wake up in the Stained Glass Museum in Chicago. The city is now in a state of complete anarchy, with people looting stores and setting buildings on fire. Nathan and Marie agreed to leave at dawn, but they don't actually have a plan or any idea where to go. Luckily, Marie had a dream that they returned to her apartment at 900 North Michigan, and they decide to do that, partly because Marie admits she stashed several cases of canned pork and beans under her bed. I did the same. They walk back to 900 North Michigan, which Chad continues to refer to as the Bloomingdale's building, and try to walk the stairs up to Marie's 26th floor apartment. But she gets too tired around the 10th floor, so Nathan carries her up the last 16 flights of stairs. Easy peasy. They gorge on pork and beans and water from the toilet tank, and Marie apologizes for having put them in this terrible situation. "We're trapped here because of my own foolishness. I honestly thought it was impossible for your doomsday scenario to take place this summer. When you and Dad would talk about it, I just laughed inside. My whole focus was on graduating in December and getting a great job, but that seems so meaningless now." Nathan looked away. He had vowed not to mention why they were trapped in Chicago. He was ready to just move forward. "It's okay, Marie. Don't beat yourself up about it." Yes, stuffing your resentment deep down inside creates a strong relationship foundation. Marie says she's been praying and that spending a week in the museum straightened out her priorities. Nathan decides to straighten out his priorities as well and says, "I enjoyed hugging and kissing you when we reunited last night, but I need to let you know I've been set apart again as a missionary, and so for now, I need to act like one." They agree not to indulge in any more hanky-panky. Thus ends chapter 1. Meanwhile, Marie's father Aaron goes into work at the NSA and illegally checks the GPS tracker in Marie's chip and sees that she's back in her apartment. He concludes that Nathan must have found her and is happy. Aaron's assignment at the NSA that day is one that doesn't make any sense. For some reason, he's been sent admissions records from an LA hospital, and he's supposed to look up the patient's chips and see if they're dead, because apparently the chip can now monitor people's vital signs. I don't understand why, if these people checked into a hospital, the hospital staff can't determine whether or not they're alive. But they're understaffed due to the Grape Death, I guess, so the NSA is helping out. Aaron looks up a chip and... If a person was alive, the word awake would show on the screen, while a deceased person's chip reading showed asleep. This politically correct labeling had irritated Aaron at first, but he realized that it was almost as if the government couldn't bring themselves to say the word dead, even though a sizable portion of the nation's population was now in that category. That's not political correctness. Does Chad really think that's political correctness? No, the government isn't afraid to say that people are dead. When a service member is killed, nobody shows up on the family's doorstep and says, "I'm afraid your son has taken a nap." No, Chad knows this isn't political correctness. He just wanted to get a jab in at political correctness and didn't actually know how to use any, as an example. This nonsense assignment Aaron's been given is just a convoluted plot device to allow Aaron to find out that Nathan's stepmother, Vanessa, is dead. Vanessa was also the mother of Nathan's half-sister, Denise, who's currently living with Aaron and Carol. Aaron knows he's going to have to inform Denise that her mother has passed out. Not passed on, not passed away, passed out. I think it's kind of strange that Aaron wasn't routinely checking the status of the parents of the girl he's babysitting, but this seems to be the first time he's looked them up. He's shocked to see that Nathan and Denise's father's chip is reporting that Garrett is alive, even though he's located in a pile of bodies stacked in the hospital parking lot. Thus ends chapter 2. Garrett Foster felt a deep pounding in his head, and his entire body ached. It felt like he was lying on pavement. He could hear the buzzing of flies around him, and as he took a deep breath, he was assaulted by a mixture of foul odors. He opened his eyes and saw a blue sky above him, and then he turned his head just enough to see a nearby sign that read, Huntington Memorial Hospital. Garrett has miraculously survived the super flu known as the Grape Death. Vanessa brought him to the hospital, where he was apparently mistaken for dead and dumped in the parking lot after the morgue overflowed. He's still pretty sick, so he drags himself across the lot, looking futilely for Vanessa. He doesn't find her, though, and I guess he's grossed out by checking corpses, so he just concludes she must be dead. He collapsed on the grass, feeling so miserable that he could only close his eyes and moan. For a brief moment, he wished to be dead like everyone else around him, but he sensed there was a purpose that he was still alive. For the first time in years, he cried out in sincere prayer. "Dear Father, I suppose I deserve this torment. Let me die if it is thy will. Otherwise, direct me where to go." As he said those words, he looked under a nearby bush and saw a Gatorade bottle. God sent Moses manna and Garrett Gatorade. Garrett briefly speaks with a passing stranger who warns him not to go into downtown LA because it's chaos, but mentions some people living on the coast. Garrett decides to try to find them and begins walking west. Thus ends chapter 3. And yes, the chapters at the beginning and end of Chad's books are always very short. Before we catch up with Nathan and Marie in a chapter that I hope will be longer than 3 pages, I want to remind you that Marie's storyline appears to be echoing Tad's storyline in the Standing in Holy Places series. So far, Marie has lost her job, hidden in a cave, more or less, and been rescued by Nathan. And we're still waiting to see if a government agent tries to kill her, if she has to cut the chip out of her hand, if she survives an earthquake, and if she hides at her in-laws' house and then never does anything interesting again. After binging on pork, beans, and toilet water, Marie takes a nap in her bed while Nathan dozes on the couch. He's awakened by someone kicking in the apartment door. Nathan jumped up and pointed the weapon at the man's chest. "Stop right there!" The man froze and put his hands in the air. "Hey, hold on. Don't shoot. I'm with the Chip Compliance Authority. I am just checking on Marie Shaw's status." The sensible thing to do when one is confronted by a government agent is to stand down and do as you're told. But Nathan knows that the chip is evil, so instead he interrogates the chip compliance officer. Marie wakes up and helps. They learn that everyone without a chip is being rounded up. The CAA guy, Sean, says, "With all of the shortages of food and medicine, the government wants to get everyone together so they can make good decisions about how to divide things up. They don't want anyone hiding and hoarding things that could benefit everyone else. You know, martial law." "Has the president actually declared martial law?" Nathan asked. "Not yet, but all of the laws are in place to make the switch," Sean said. He nodded toward the boxes of pork and beans. "For example, I'll need to confiscate those boxes from you." "Not the franks and beans." CAA officer Sean tells them that they'll never get away with stealing his switchblades. The CAA will trace his location and send Brix's guys. Brix, spelled with an X, is both the name of Elon Musk's latest child and the name of the Occupy Wall Street protester who now runs Chicago. Sean explains. "Brix pretty much runs this city," Sean said. "He started a few years ago as a small-time gang leader, but now he's got more power than the mayor. Everyone is intimidated by him because he kills first and asks questions later. So the federal government decided it would be best to bring him into the CAA fold if they wanted to avoid total chaos here." The gang leader who became a protest organizer. The protest organizer who became a government enforcer. The government enforcer who defied the government by burning Chicago to the ground. Nathan was bothered to hear that the government was cooperating with criminals to keep the peace, but it really wasn't surprising. I mean, I was surprised, given that Brix is supposedly the problem. But if there's one thing that's consistent in these books, it's that nothing the government does makes sense. Then it's Marie's turn to do something that makes no sense. Nathan ignored the question and turned to Marie. "Do you have a rope or something we can tie him up with? We need to get out of here without him on our trail." As Nathan kept the weapon pointed at Sean, Marie went to a closet, pulled out a vacuum cleaner, and cut off the cord. "Will this work?" Nathan nodded. "That should do." "A vacuum cleaner cord? She doesn't have a robe belt or a shoelace or the string from a hoodie. She's gonna use a vacuum cleaner cord? And why did she cut it before she bothered asking Nathan if it would work?" They attempt to tie CAA officer Sean up. Nathan tied his hands tightly together behind his back, but as he lifted Sean's ankle, The larger man swiftly pivoted and kicked Nathan powerfully in the chest, knocking him down. Sean then squirmed to his feet and ran toward the door. Marie fired off an awkward shot that hit the wall, and then he was gone. I feel like Marie should have been able to hit him from 4 feet away, but whatever. Squirmed to his feet is just a bad description. This isn't quite a government trying to kill Marie, but it does resemble Tad's encounter with Jonas in the Great Gathering, so I'm going to count it. They decide they better get out of there, but first they need to cut Marie's chip out, which Nathan does with a razor blade. I'll spare you the details. Nathan helped her get the bandage in place, and the bleeding stopped quickly. He couldn't resist kissing her on the forehead. Good job, he told her. That was very brave. That definitely goes on the list. They load the pork and beans and some boiled water into a rolling suitcase and go downstairs to Bloomingdale's. Nathan spotted an oversized wheelchair that had been abandoned in the store, and an idea formed in his head. I think I found our way out of Chicago, he said. We'll put the suitcase on the wheelchair's footpads, and then I'll push you like you're on the verge of dying. I'm sure we can find some clothes in here to help disguise us. While Nathan found some frumpy hats and a blanket they could use, Marie went behind a sales counter, where she found a large piece of cardboard and a Sharpie. She wrote in big letters, "Black flu victim. Please help me." Nathan smiled. That should keep people away. I don't know why they need disguises, other than because Nathan wants to be Ethan Hunt. Are they worried about being recognized? Do victims of the Grape Death have cold heads that require frumpy hats? I feel like Chad's thinking of Weekend at Bernie's without consciously realizing it. They leave the building and head out onto the street, where everyone sees their sign and steers clear. Nathan had considered 2 possible places they could go, but as he looked at the billowing black smoke to the north, he ruled out the Chicago Temple. Judging by the smoke in the air, it really looked like the northern section of the city was going up in flames. So Nathan pushed Marie south. Their destination was nearly 300 miles away, but it seemed like the only place they'd find safety. Where are we going? Marie finally asked. Nauvoo. This requires a bit of context. In 1840, the LDS Church purchased land in Illinois and named it Nauvoo. The Mormons were fleeing Missouri at this point, and about 12,000 LDS Church members followed Joseph Smith to Nauvoo. The Saints built a huge, gorgeous temple there, and then Joseph Smith was assassinated, and the majority of the church decided to follow Brigham Young out west. Today, Nauvoo has a population under 1,000, but there is a Mormon temple there. Not the same one, but a new one, and various LDS historical sites that function as tourist attractions. Now, why has Nathan decided they should walk 250 miles to Nauvoo? It's not actually 300, even though Chad thinks it is. I don't really know. They could have walked 170 miles, which is 80 miles less, and made it back to Nathan's car, which he left in a Walmart parking lot near what I assume was the Julian Dubuque Bridge. But I guess they wanted to do some sightseeing before America burns to the ground. Thus ends Chapter 4. Garrett has been walking very slowly toward the west coast, stopping from time to time to drink from puddles, because for all his prepper enthusiasm, Chad still doesn't know a thing about safe drinking water practices. Garrett has been walking down the highway, and he finally reaches the exit that will take him to the ocean, but it's being guarded by 2 armed men who debate whether or not to let him pass. One asks, "What are your skills? Can you fish?" "Absolutely. I'll fish all day." The men turned away from Garrett, but he could still hear their conversation. "What do you think?" one of them asked. "Sergeant Casey said we need more men down on the pier." Garrett's ears perked up. "Did you say Sergeant Casey? Lane Spacey Casey?" Both men spun around. "How did you know that?" the taller one asked. Garrett smiled. "I spent a year in Iraq with him. I knew he was from Southern California, but who would have thought we'd meet up again?" Well, how convenient. And unlikely. I don't know why Chad felt the need to include this really dumb plot element. He already had a perfectly good reason for the men to let Garrett pass. They need people who can fish. What are the chances that Garrett would happen to bump into someone he knew in a state where he doesn't even live? Chad is weird about nicknames. As in, he almost never uses them in his writing. In Escape to Zion, Tom was known as Mo, which stood for Mighty One, and Emma's son David asked to be called Dave. But those are the only nicknames used between Chad's third book and this one, his 11th. And the two in this book just seem to be words that rhyme with the names. Anyway, the armed men find out that he's a friend of Sergeant Casey's and let him through. Now, I'm going to put my writer's hat on for a moment to complain about what comes next. In his nonfiction, we've heard Chad make repeated remarks about how he's a reporter who just gives you the facts and doesn't indulge in flowery descriptions. And I've mentioned before that he hates writing scene descriptions. Here, we have a perfect example of why that's a problem. Once he got off the freeway, he saw several people outside, and Garrett had to admit it reminded him of a hippie commune. People were unbathed and not wearing much clothing, but they would wave to him as he passed by. An older lady even walked over to him and handed him a piece of bread. Where is he? What's going on? Is he on a boardwalk? A street? A beach? Saying that he got off the freeway exit doesn't actually tell us anything except that he's no longer on the freeway. In my head, I'm imagining that he walked into that Hollywood version of the afterlife, where it's all just bright white nothingness and gauzy distant windows. That's what I'm imagining is at the end of this freeway off-ramp. The woman who handed him bread leads him to the grocery store where Sergeant Casey is. "I'm here to see Sergeant Casey," he said confidently. "Please tell him Garrett, the ferret, Foster is here." The woman hardly had time to turn around before they heard a man call out, "Ferret Foster? In the flesh? Unbelievable!" Sergeant Casey is thrilled to have Garrett with him. Apparently he runs this little camp of survivors, and he puts Garrett to work as a fisherman. Thus ends chapter 5. The next chapter opens with 2 pages of Aaron reminiscing about how evil the government is. The government had spent billions of dollars over the previous decade to track citizens' various social media and email usage. The chip had simplified everything. Now anyone using the chip literally couldn't even go to the restroom without the government knowing about it. Gross. And also, why? Why does the government want to monitor our urination? Is it because the communists are trying to steal our precious bodily fluids? Aaron checks Marie's chip again and learns that her status has been changed to fugitive, meaning she cut the chip out. He goes home and whispers the news to his wife. "Did you see that Chicago's on fire?" she asked. "I'm so worried about Marie. Are you still able to track her?" "Sort of," he whispered. "I think Nathan cut out her chip today. It looked like people were searching for her." Carol's knees buckled, and Aaron caught her in his arms. "She'll be okay," he said softly, hoping he was right. They watch the news, which is full of stories about Chicago burning down. Thus ends chapter 6. Nathan and Marie have managed to travel 30 miles in 3 days. For reasons I don't understand, Marie is still sitting in the wheelchair, holding the suitcase full of pork and beans, and Nathan is still pushing her. That seems to be why it's taking them forever to get anywhere. They pass a country club and decide to stop. Marie's eyes lit up. "This place seems nice. Maybe we can find someone here. I'd like to trade some of these cans for something different." Nathan was definitely getting tired of pork and beans. It was making them both feel sluggish. Yes, well, living on pork and beans will do that. The country club is locked, so they take a nap on the grass outside, and they're awakened by 2 men. They're security officers for the country club, and they say that they're going to have to turn Nathan and Marie over to the Chip Compliance Authority. But first, they've got a city authority coming to talk to them. They put them in a room in the country club, and a large, middle-aged black man enters and begins shouting at them. He tells Nathan he has one chance to explain why he didn't get the chip. "Tell the truth," the spirit prompted. Nathan's heart began pounding. The truth wasn't what this guy wanted to hear, but he'd take a shot. "I'm a Christian," Nathan said. "My church leaders counseled us against getting the chip, and I followed that guidance. I believe God doesn't approve of it. The chip limits our freedom, and at this point, I'd sacrifice my life before I would get it. Marie joins in, and they both swear they'd rather die than get the chip. The other two men returned to the room and took hold of them. They forced them back into the clubhouse lobby, where the black man stepped toward them and said, "There's one other thing I need to discuss before you die." He reached into his pocket and held out an object in front of him. A small metal cross. Nathan blinked hard, and the black man put his arm around Nathan's shoulder. "You passed," the man said. "I'm Pastor Haskell, the leader of the local Baptist church." Nathan was still unsure what this meant. "So you're not going to lock us up?" "No, we want you to join us," the pastor said. "Good Christians need to stick together." I think he meant self-righteous Christians. That was very corny and dramatic and so very Chad. Pastor Haskell says that he's gathered together a bunch of Christians and they're about to leave for a summer camp, and Nathan and Marie can join them because he saw the light of Christ in their eyes. Among the group were people of seemingly every color and nationality, all working together. The men in the group had fashioned some contraptions with plywood and bicycle tires that sure looked to Nathan like hand carts. It warmed Nathan's heart to see how the Lord was inspiring Christians of all denominations to take refuge from the coming devastation. Did someone mention to Chad that having an interracial group of terrorists didn't quite give him the "I'm not a racist" cred he was looking for? I think so. Nathan confesses that they're LDS. Pastor Haskell raised an eyebrow. "Like the Mitt Romney kind of Mormons?" "Yes." "All the better," he said. "I used to hate you guys, but before moving here I lived in Long Island, New York, and I saw your members in their yellow shirts helping clean up after Hurricane Sandy." "You mean the Mormon Helping Hands?" Nathan asked. "Yeah, that's it. I got to know some of your leaders, and they offered my congregation more help than my own leaders did. So now I see we're all on the same team." The Mormon Helping Hands program is real, and it did assist in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. I'm not sure why Pastor Haskell hated the LDS church before that. Pastors are like anyone else, and they have their foibles, and some of them are terrible people, but by and large, at least in my experience, they usually try not to hate other people. I think this is just Chad's persecution complex and desire to prove that he's right coming through. Nathan sees some people setting something up and asks Pastor Haskell if they need help. "No, they'll be fine," he said. "Just enjoy the show." "What show?" Pastor Haskell gave him a funny look. "Hey, the country club might be falling apart, but we're still going to celebrate the 4th of July. Nathan felt like he'd been slapped. He hadn't even realized what day it was. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be disrespectful. I had honestly lost track of the calendar." I find this interaction so bizarre. Losing track of the date and forgetting the 4th of July is disrespectful? Nathan is pushing his girlfriend across the Midwest in a wheelchair, living on Franks and beans, and God, or maybe the nation, still expect him to honor the 4th of July? Get your priorities straight, Nathan. Thus ends chapter 7. The next section is titled 2 Months Later. As the summer of discontent rolled on, new problems seemed to crop up across the United States. Some states were relatively unaffected by the turmoil, except for an increase in violent crime and gas shortages, but other areas seemed to get hit repeatedly by those problems, as well as power outages and civil unrest. I guess Chad just didn't have anything else he wanted to happen in this section. He spends the entire rest of this one-page section describing a political cartoon map of the USA superimposed over a flag, which has been symbolically burned and rent in spots correlating to major disaster areas, and I have no idea what the purpose of these paragraphs might be. Thus ends 2 months later. In that time, Garrett has settled into a happy life as a fisherman on the Santa Monica Pier. As he watched the ocean waves roll in, Garrett's thoughts drifted for the 1,000th time to his beloved Vanessa. He knew she wouldn't have left him alone at the hospital if she was okay, so he had resigned himself to the fact she was dead. Her body might have been in that same hospital parking lot where he had awakened, but now he'd never know. He hoped Nathan had somehow reconnected with Denise back in Utah. He still intended to return there if an opportunity presented itself, but right now he was just trying to take life a day at a time. This man left his 12-year-old daughter home alone while he and his wife traveled out of state, and he isn't anxious to get back to her? Nah, she's probably fine. She probably hooked up with that older brother she barely knows who doesn't have a cell phone and was working out of town when the troubles began. Any sane person would be walking back to Utah, or at least making a plan to do so. Garrett lands a 6-foot-long shark, and his buddy, Sergeant Casey, declares a feast. Everyone digs into thick, juicy, grilled shark steaks. In the middle of the feast, Sergeant Casey announces that he's in contact with the outside world, which apparently means beyond the freeway in this context, and there's a terrible storm coming. They need to abandon their beach camp, move inland, and take shelter. Unfortunately, out of 200 people, only about 40 are willing to leave with Sergeant Casey. Everyone else says they'll take their chances. Garrett, of course, goes with Sergeant Casey, and they find an undamaged house in which to shelter. By the way, Chad has started referring to Sergeant Casey by his first name, Lane, which he uses here. Garrett sat up in fear as a wave of large hailstones hammered down on the roof. It sounded like a herd of horses was galloping above them. Then a window shattered, followed by another. People shrieked and scurried into other rooms. Some panicked and actually ran outside, where they were struck down and severely injured by the falling ice. "This is crazy!" Lane shouted. He stood up in the darkness, but was unsure how to even respond. "What should we—" At that moment, the front window shattered as a large tree limb crashed through it. Garrett rolled away, receiving only a few scrapes, but the limb caught Lane directly in the chest and drove him into the floor. They get the tree limb off Lane, but it's too late. Even in the darkness, it was clear that Lane had sustained a major head injury. Garrett put his head on his friend's chest, but he couldn't hear a heartbeat or detect any breathing. "No! You can't die!" Garrett shouted. The others moved away back to their own families, allowing Garrett to vent his frustration and grief as he held Lane's body. I guess Chad introduced this character just to kill him off, which is kind of cruel. The storm continued to beat down relentlessly throughout the night, but Garrett didn't let go of his friend. When morning came, he could see that one of the tree's branches had pierced Lane's neck. He had likely died instantly. The storm has also destroyed the Santa Monica Pier and wiped away the scores of people living there. "Thank you, my dear friend. I'll never forget you." Garrett reached down and touched Lane's face. Then he wrapped himself in a blanket and headed south in search of civilization so he could find his children. Nothing else mattered to him now except reuniting with Denise and Nathan. 2 things. First, Utah is northeast of Santa Monica, not south. Second, when did Garrett decide he cared about his children again, and why? Chad writes this like the storm inspired Garrett to find Nathan and Denise, but there's nothing about that in the scene. The way Chad has written it, all Garrett thought about during the storm was his dead buddy, and now suddenly his priorities have changed. Thus ends Chapter 8. In Orem, Utah, life has continued pretty much like normal for Carol, Aaron, and the half-sister of the boy their daughter likes. By now, they've gotten word of a terrible storm heading their way. As you may recall, this storm originated off the coast of Russia and is going to make its way all the way around the globe, taking the most ridiculous and unrealistic of paths. Carol, Aaron, and Denise build a mattress fort and hide inside it, praying. Hail pounds the roof and wind tears up the trees and Carol's tomato plants, but 15 minutes later the worst is past and they're all okay. Thus ends Chapter 9. Since we last saw them, Marie, Nathan, Pastor Haskell, and a big bunch of Baptists have walked to a campground in Springfield, Illinois. Nathan is very happy that Marie has spent the last 2 months being humbled. As Nathan approached Marie, his heart started beating just a little faster. He had admired her for years, But since the day he'd rescued her from the museum in downtown Chicago, she had taken huge leaps in her maturity and priorities. She hadn't worn makeup in more than 2 months, but Nathan thought she was more beautiful than ever before. Now that they'd lost all of their material possessions, including the cell phone that had once been seemingly attached to Marie's left hand, she had blossomed into a true saint. She had helped Sylvia's mother with her children every day of the journey, and the kids even called her Aunt Marie. Thank goodness Marie has seen the light and accepted that she's not meant to do anything other than care for children. Even more exciting, they're all doing the Atkins diet now. The camp supervisors had already been raising rabbits as part of the camp's summer youth program, and now they purposely let them reproduce as often as possible. This provided a seemingly endless supply of meat. Marie had struggled with the meal on the first night, having had a pet bunny as a girl, but now she savored every bite. I also used to have a pet bunny. Unfortunately, a family in the camp has been struck with the dreaded Grape Death. I was hoping the flu had faded away, Nathan whispered to Marie. At least we haven't been with the Tallies. I'm not sure I could even tell you who they are. Marie looked at the ground. I could. They're Sylvia's cousins. I was with them yesterday. Marie and the others are forced to quarantine in a cabin while everyone else weathers the terrible hailstorm inside a meeting hall. All of the camp's gardens are destroyed. No word on how the rabbits fared. The next day, Nathan learns that Pastor Haskell has contracted the Grape Death, and Nathan kind of loses his head. How is Marie? Nathan asked. I want to see her. The pastor's shoulders slumped. She's resting now. Maybe you can see her later. She's dying, isn't she? Nathan cried, and the pastor looked away. I need to see her. Yes, go to her side, a voice said. Nathan knew that voice, and without hesitation he leapt over the rope that marked the quarantined area and ran toward the cabin he'd seen Marie go into 2 days earlier. Pastor Haskell shouted, Nathan, don't do it! But Nathan has already done it. Good luck trying to stand between that boy and a text message from God. He bursts into the cabin and finds Marie lying on a bed, nearly dead, next to the little girl she was looking after, Sylvia. Nathan moved closer and was stunned to see Marie's face and arms covered with purple pimples. Some had popped and were oozing onto the blanket. Pastor Haskell had entered the cabin and sadly shook his head at Marie's condition. This is terrible, Nathan said to him, thinking it might be best for Marie if she passed away. Even if she recovered, her mind might never be the same. He could barely resist caressing her face, though, and moved his hand toward her. Nathan goes to touch her face, and Pastor Haskell stops him, saying that the virus has mutated into something sinister, and Marie's pimple pus is highly contagious, which is just an image I didn't need in my head. I assume that the pus is purple. Is that wrong? Then he says that the Grape Death is going to kill everyone in time, which is pretty strange given that less than a page earlier he told Nathan he was hoping to fight the illness off and rejoin them. Oh, Marie, Nathan cried, shaking his head in grief. Use your priesthood and let the power of God be manifest. The words struck his heart. He immediately placed his hands on Marie's head and said, Marie Shaw, in the name of Jesus Christ and by the power of the holy Melchizedek priesthood I hold, I command you to be made whole in body and spirit. I command the illness that afflicts you to depart. Be healed. Nathan backed away, and Marie's body convulsed 3 times as if she'd been shocked with a jolt of electricity. Then she gave a loud moan and opened her eyes. She glanced at Nathan. Then they all stared in amazement as the pimples on her arms appeared to dry up and flake away, leaving clear, pink skin. The pimples on her face did the same thing. Better than Clarisil. Then Nathan gets another prompting. Give blessings to the others in the cabin. The Lord wants them to be preserved as well. Then your work among this people is finished and you must move on to Nauvoo. What happens next is a frenzy of blessings. Nathan's like a superhero. He heals Pastor Haskell. He heals little Sylvia. He heals some mean old lady and somehow also makes her less mean. He heals everyone of the Grape Death. Although Chad never says this, because Nathan and Marie take off for Nauvoo right afterward, like they literally walk out of the cabin, grab their wheelchair and suitcase and walk off. But based on Chad's previous writing, I think it's safe to assume that all the Baptists convert. I'm not really sure what happened to Chad to put the Baptists in his good graces, but it must have been something. Pastor Haskell loads up their suitcase with rabbit jerky and sends Nathan and Marie on their way. Thus ends chapter 10. Aaron goes to church on Sunday in order to keep an eye on the Mormons who didn't gather to the mountains. Church leaders have asked him to visit a particular ward to make sure no one's trying to become a false prophet. What follows is basically veiled criticism of people who attend church only on Sundays and don't completely devote themselves to the church. The man running the meeting opens up the floor for people to talk about their experiences during the storm and to give testimony. Aaron nodded, pretending as if this was perfectly normal, before stealing a glance toward the empty sacrament table. Once Brother Thomas was back in his seat, Aaron nudged him and whispered, "What about the sacrament?" "We only do that once a month now," he said. "It still counts the same, right?" Aaron was stunned at the response. He was even more surprised when, for the next hour, a dozen members came to the pulpit to complain about how the church and the government hadn't helped them in their time of need. I don't think Jesus is standing around with a clipboard keeping track of how often people take communion. Aaron sends a message to church leadership letting them know that everyone left is a godless whiner. He goes into work the next day and discovers that the lack of government response to the damage from the storm has led to rioting in 20 cities. In the middle of the day, the president comes on TV and says that there's a new strain of the Grape Death going around. In response to the combination of the storm's devastation and the return of the illness, I have consulted with our friends at the United Nations during this time of need. They have kindly agreed to send a large contingent of peacekeepers to assist us in rebuilding our cities and to help us control any lawlessness that might take place. Isn't that what the chip was supposed to do? Chad, like many conspiracy theorists, believes that the UN is evil and that it's secretly intended to bring about a new world order. There's no evidence of this. Aaron actually dug his fingernails into his palms to make sure he wasn't dreaming. He asked himself, did the US president really just instruct his fellow countrymen to follow the orders of UN forces? What's next? Martial law? As soon as he thinks this, the president declares martial law. After the president's speech ends, Aaron looked around the room at dozens of people who had supported this president for years. He thought he might hear some comments in defense of the president, but everyone sat motionless for several seconds, as if a truth had finally dawned on them. The kind of positive change they'd been expecting was never going to come. This paragraph is painfully anticlimactic. Aaron calls Carol, who's also watched the speech, and they agree it's time for her and Denise to get their butts to the mountain camp. Thus ends chapter 11. Garrett, despite having said he wants to get back to Utah to find his kids, has now walked 150 miles south to San Diego. I have no idea why Chad had him do this. Regardless, this is what Garrett sees when he gets there. He was soon close enough to the port that he could see dozens of men who seemed to be speaking Russian to each other. They were methodically unloading a wide variety of equipment onto a dock from several huge ships. They had already unloaded dozens of large, strange-looking trucks, which were now parked in long rows. Some of the trucks had 4 or 5 drive axles and looked too wide to drive down a single lane of a highway. The trucks were loaded with a great deal of cargo, such as food, medical supplies, fuel, and other necessities. These strange transport vehicles are a common feature of LDS doomsday visions and also appear in Visions of Glory. Somehow, Garrett fails to notice that the UN troops have spotted him. Before Garrett could react, a man jumped out of the jeep with a weapon in one hand and some sort of device in the other. "Don't move, Garrett Foster," the man said. "You're now in the custody of the United Nations." Garrett asks how the man knew his name, and the man says, "Duh, you're Chip." Garrett's taken to a holding center. Garrett was soon standing under a pavilion in a Long Beach park with 50 other people who had been rounded up that morning. They were all handcuffed, and he knew trying to escape would be fruitless. There were several more men than women in the group, but the women looked more hardened and angry, as if they were ready to kill someone, and probably already had. Each person is interrogated by UN forces, and Garrett gets to see one of these angry, hardened women interviewed. After her chip was scanned, the lead official smiled a little. Your last occupation was as a dancer for the Los Angeles Lakers? That's right, she said. You got a problem with that? No, he said. I just don't quite know where you'll fit into our new society. The records show you were divorced twice and have lived off food stamps for the past 5 years. That's not very productive. The woman started to cry. Please don't judge me. I can do anything. Cook, clean, sweep. Ah, yes, those angry, hardened cheerleaders. What a plague upon the earth they are. What's amazing to me about this scene is that Chad is so busy ragging on women for receiving SNAP benefits that he forgets the UN are supposed to be evil and gives them his own values. He's so excited to diss this woman that he forgets the UN soldiers are supposed to be the bad guys. Although he doesn't spell it out, it's pretty clear if you read between the lines that most of the people the UN interviews are being executed. After each person was questioned, he or she was escorted toward one of 2 buildings. So far, Garrett had seen nearly 24 people escorted to the building on the left where the insane ones had been taken. Only 2 people, a man and a woman, had been taken to the building on the right. Both had seemed more normal than the rest of the group. The man had been a mechanic, while the woman could speak several languages. When Garrett's turn comes, they scan his chip and say, "You're military? Why didn't you say so? Of course we have a use for you." They're going to need assistance in Salt Lake soon, so they send Garrett to the building almost no one gets sent to and tell him to take a shower and grab some grub. He feels happy and like he has a reason to live again. Thus ends chapter 12. Aaron and Carol have realized that they should have sent Carol and Denise to one of the mountain camps sooner. Now, with martial law in place, it's going to be harder for them to travel. The president's proclamation of martial law had changed everything. Now the employees of the Chip Compliance Authority were allowed to essentially work without restraint, especially when it came to any reports of unauthorized chip removal. When a so-called fugitive was caught, it was an automatic 6-month prison sentence, if the CAA enforcers didn't accidentally kill the person while transporting them to prison. Aaron was sickened by the number of times he'd had to categorize a death as RADT, meaning resisted arrest during transport. If they're being transported, haven't they already been arrested? It's not like the police are going to take them someplace and then arrest them. So Aaron and Carol have come up with a plan to fake Carol and Denise's deaths and then get them to one of the nice white camps. Chad specifies that Carol knows the password to get into the best camps, just in case anyone was worried that they'd end up in one of the crappy BYOB camps. Not that anyone in the camps probably has any B, but you know what I mean. It's bring your own Inca Cola. Carol declares she's taking Denise to Target. Carol asked, "Denise, why don't we go to Target? I've been wanting to buy you that new dress you tried on the last time we were there." She's just been daydreaming about buying this random urchin clothing. Also, just because I don't know where else to stick this, Aaron isn't going to fake his death and go to the camps. And Chad never explains why not. Carol and Denise go to Target and buy the dress, plus 2 Snickers bars. And while they're standing outside Target eating their Snickers bars, like you do, Carol casually brings up the camps. "This is a very important night," Carol said. "You and I have a special trip. Have we told you very much about the camps in the mountains where some of the Mormons have gone?" "A little. Isn't that what Nathan was helping with?" "That's right. He was taking food to the camps so everyone there would have enough to eat. I think it would be great to live there. It certainly isn't as dangerous as it is here." Denise nodded. "You know what? I want to go to the camps." Well, that sounded natural. Carol says she wants to go to the camps too, and that she's hoping Marie and Nathan are there. And Denise says, Let's go. Carol has to explain that the Chip Compliance Authority would track them down using their chips. Denise sat silently for a moment, then said, I'm willing to cut mine out. I've been wanting to for a long time. Carol was surprised. She was wondering how she was ever going to convince Denise to cut out her chip, but she'd already come up with the idea herself. What 12-year-old girl is gung-ho to have something cut out of her hand without anesthetic? To be clear, there has been zero lead up to this. I didn't even know Denise had the chip until this scene. She's never talked about it, been talked to about it, expressed an opinion regarding it, and we never learn why she wants to cut it out. Chad just couldn't think of a way for Carol to convince her to remove it, so he hand-waved it. Carol says, I'll do it if you will, and then pulls the first aid kit out of the trunk of her car and cuts their chips out right there in the parking lot. Which is ridiculous, because I guarantee Target has security cameras overlooking the parking lot. Then she pulls hiking backpacks out of the trunk and tells Denise to stuff her new dress in one, and they start walking. When they were about a block away, Carol said, There's just one more thing to do. She pulled a small box from her pocket and opened it up. Inside was a remote control pad. She entered a few digits, then confidently pressed a red button. Boom! The car exploded into a raging fireball. Aaron had rigged the detonation device to the gas cans in the trunk. Their microchips and their former lives were now gone. So, working for the NSA taught Aaron to be a demolitions expert? He's a data analyst. Not everyone who works for the government learns how to blow things up, the same way not everyone who works with computers knows how to hack. Aaron waits less than an hour before getting in his car and driving to Target, because that won't seem suspicious. What is he going to say if the cops notice him watching the fire? My wife and the random child we've taken in were gone for 45 minutes. Who takes that long to pick out a dress? I was worried. He sees the big blaze and all the fire trucks and drives back home. The next morning, the police arrive and give him the bad news, and he falls to his knees and weeps. What happened? Aaron asked. What makes a car explode for no reason? We think it was intentionally set, Officer Peters said. Did your wife have any enemies? Well, we're Mormon, but other than that, I didn't think so. Come on! 93% of the people who live in Orem are LDS. The chances of being targeted for that are infinitesimal. But the cops, who statistically are almost certainly also LDS, buy it. They apparently haven't bothered to go pull the security footage of the parking lot and watch Carol cut out her own chip and Denise's chip and shove them under the car tire and then pull the backpacks out of the trunk that's full of gas canisters. Thus ends chapter 13. Nathan and Marie are walking to Nauvoo, and it's very, very boring. Then Marie says, Hey, look, the Carthage jail. Isn't that where Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram were killed? It is, Nathan said, suddenly feeling a surge of emotion. But what emotion was it, Chad? Why aren't you able to describe it? Just asking. They decide to take a quick detour to see the jail, which is all well and dandy. But when they get there, Nathan starts telling Marie the story of what happened, like she doesn't know it or something. She's the one who pointed out the jail. It's just one of those strange moments of entrenched sexism. Like, of course they'd go there, and Nathan would deliver a lecture on the history of the place. They finally reach the Nauvoo temple, and it's at this point that Nathan realizes he doesn't have any better idea why they're there than I do. Yeah, I'm Nathan, and this is Marie. We've come from Chicago, and we don't have the chip. I'm a maintenance missionary, and we're here to help you if you need us. We just figured that in this time of national crisis, we'd abandon our families, including my much younger orphaned sibling, and see if you guys needed any help with dusting, vacuuming, gardening. They meet the temple president, who explains that he feels like the spirit called him to be there. Now I know this is where I'm supposed to be. I know what you mean, Marie said, glancing at Nathan. The Lord is watching over us. She had come to realize that the Chicago internship wasn't what the Lord had intended for her, but through it all, she had grown spiritually and become a better person in ways she likely wouldn't have if she'd stayed in Utah. Wait, I'm confused. I can think of two ways to interpret this. Either God intended for Marie to take the internship and then have things fall apart so she could go get humbled and become a better person, or else God didn't want her to take the internship and she disobeyed him but ended up becoming a better person anyway, which kind of suggests you don't actually have to obey God in order to become a good person. I'm going to assume Chad intended the former interpretation. Thus ends chapter 14. Garrett is now in LA with the UN, acting as a peacekeeper. This mostly seems to involve rounding people up and sticking them in holding cages, because Chad has no idea what UN peacekeepers actually do. Garrett continues to be a character who makes no sense. He basically knows that the UN is doing something terrible to 95% of the people it rounds up, but he's fine with helping them. Then he finds a 15-year-old girl who just gave birth behind a trash can, and suddenly he wants her to sit up front in the 5-axled transporter, which leads to this interaction. The driver said angrily, "She can't be up here. She belongs in the back with the others." Garrett stared silently at him, causing the driver to look away as the girl took a seat between them. "Go straight to the hospital," Garrett said. "We can come back for the others. This girl and her baby need immediate help." "Sir, this isn't protocol," the driver muttered. "We don't have time for this. If they die, they die." Garrett glanced at him. "You know what? We've got all the time in the world. These captives aren't going anywhere. Drive to the hospital. It's only a few blocks." They reach the hospital, and the girl declares she's going to name her baby Grant Foster Mendoza in his honor. Not just Grant Mendoza, but Grant Foster Mendoza, like he's George Washington or something. Then we learn how, even though Garrett knew that the UN was up to no good, he went ahead and informed them when they made plans he knew wouldn't work and advised them on how best to get through to the American people. He even composed and recorded a message for them to play over the loudspeakers on their 5-axled transporter as they drove around the city, in which he assured them that the UN was there to help and they should all come on out. It is one thing to keep your head down in dangerous circumstances, and quite another to say, you know, I can make your extermination operation much more efficient. Listen to this. By midnight, almost everyone who had emerged from hiding had a full stomach and were registered in the UN's database. They were told to stay nearby, because breakfast would be served starting at 7 a.m. However, they weren't told that after breakfast, they would be forcibly marched to major outdoor venues such as the Rose Bowl, the Los Angeles Coliseum, and Dodger Stadium for additional evaluations by the UN peacekeepers. The UN is basically using these stadiums as slaughter pens. The next section talks about how Garrett was rapidly promoted up through the ranks at the UN. He pleaded for peace several times when citizens had wanted to fight the UN forces, sparing both sides a lot of needless bloodshed through his actions. This isn't go along to get along. This is full legal and moral complicity. He's discouraging people from fighting back against an invasion force, and he knows it. Finally, we get to hear Garrett's justification for what he's doing. He had only joined up with the UN because he'd had no other choice. At least he was still alive to possibly do something about America's situation later on. Sometimes when he went to bed, his conscience bothered him for promoting the UN's agenda, but he figured that by acting as a mediator, he was helping his fellow Americans avoid painful, unnecessary deaths. By the end of this paragraph, he's reframed his role as acting as a mediator. He's luring people in through deception. He knows that the people who get taken to the stadiums don't come back. Now, I'm going to read you the next paragraph, but I'm going to read you just the first sentence, and after we've looked at that, we'll look at the rest of the paragraph. I want to put this sentence together with the paragraph I just read before we get into the rest of it. He couldn't deny, though, that he truly despised what many Americans had become. Okay, what does this sentence mean? It means that Garrett hates what Americans have become, and he hates them so much that he can't deny the intensity of his feelings. This word here, however, though, is telling us that this idea somehow stands in contradiction to the idea that came immediately before it. If we jump back to the last sentence in the last paragraph, we can identify the idea that Chad is referencing. Let's put the two sentences together. Sometimes, when he went to bed, his conscience bothered him for promoting the UN's agenda, but he figured that by acting as a mediator, he was helping his fellow Americans avoid painful, unnecessary deaths. He couldn't deny, though, that he truly despised what many Americans had become. The UN's agenda is to kill a lot of Americans, and sometimes Garrett's conscience bothers him because he's helping them, but he also kind of agrees with them and feels Americans deserve what they're getting. So he's trying to save them, but the truth is that he, too, despises them. They don't really deserve mercy. Now you have a full understanding of what's happening in this passage. The important takeaway is that Garrett feels Americans deserve to be killed by the UN, and it follows, logically, that he'll spend the rest of the paragraph explaining exactly why Americans deserve death. He couldn't deny, though, that he truly despised what many Americans had become. Even after several months on a limited diet in primitive conditions, many of these people still had big bellies, flabby chins, and a general unhealthy appearance. They also had foul mouths and an unwarranted holier-than-thou attitude toward the peacekeepers. Yeah. Chad feels that fat people, people who curse, and people who think they're better than others deserve to die. It's flat out shocking. How could he have written this? I mean, aside from his criteria lacking any semblance of reason or practical underpinning, this is the most astonishing case of projection I've ever seen. Except the cursing. He might really not do that, I have no idea. But he's definitely fat and he's definitely holier than thou. And I'm not saying that to shame him, because I, personally, don't think those things are worthy of death. And then he ends the paragraph and the scene with this whopper of a wind-up. There were times when Garrett wanted to slap them and say, "Wake up and behave yourselves so they'll keep treating you nicely. We blew it. The good times are gone." I feel like the two halves of my brain are just trying to cleave apart. They blew it? Blew what? This whole image is so over the top that I can't read it as anything but funny. Did Chad even realize what he'd written? Like, if you pointed to these two paragraphs and said, "Did you realize you were writing that people who curse deserve to die?" What would he say in response? Would he say, "Yeah, they do"? Or would he be like, "Oh." I'm not even sure he's conscious of his own meaning. I suspect he spends a lot more time thinking about being a writer than he does about what he's actually writing. I feel like I ought to say more about this, because the magnitude of Chad's insanity here is vast. But what else is there to say? He's off his gourd. All I can do is move on. In the next scene, Garrett convinces one of his new UN buddies, who has computer access, to look up his wife and daughter. Their chip database confirms that Vanessa is dead, but Garrett is shocked to see that his 12-year-old daughter, Denise, is listed as a possible fugitive. Apparently, the police were suspicious when an NSA employee's wife's car just exploded while parked with the engine turned off. The chapter ends with Garrett reiterating to himself that he needs to get back to Utah. Aaron is driving to work at the NSA one morning when an earthquake hits. He heard a very loud rumbling, as if he were standing next to the tracks while a freight train approached. Suddenly the car somehow jerked upward, and only Aaron's seatbelt kept him from hitting his head on the roof of the car. He looked around and saw other vehicles doing the same bouncy maneuver. It finally dawned on him that this was a severe earthquake, and possibly the big one that the citizens of Utah had been anticipating for decades. He pulls over as best he can and sees a coworker named Whitney crash her car into a crevasse that opens up in the road. He tries to help her, but she's already dead. He ends up walking the rest of the way to the NSA, only to discover that his fellow coworkers are standing outside the gates. "What's going on?" Aaron asked him. "They won't let us in," Tom said. "They claim they're in lockdown mode because they think the data is somehow vulnerable in all of this confusion. But we all know this place has a series of backup battery sites. The power never goes out here." The reason security won't let them in is that several of the NSA buildings were damaged in the quake and are now unstable, and one of them is on fire. I'm not quite sure why the employees want to get into their burning offices so bad. Aaron says, "It's not like any of us want to work today. We just want to patch up our injuries and maybe help put out that fire." Tom nodded. "Exactly." He's kind of proving my point here. Other than band-aids, sinks, and death by smoke inhalation, what can the offices really provide? What's going on in this scene is that Chad wants there to be a violent confrontation between the NSA security officers and the office employees. Why? Because he craves violence and bloodshed, so he's going to have his characters argue irrationally until they get themselves killed. Aaron's comment about Whitney seemed to trigger something dark in Tom. Suddenly he moved toward one of the guards and shouted, "Come on, let us in! People are injured and dying out here. You know we're not a threat." "Don't come any closer," the guard said anxiously, backing up a couple of steps and pointing his pistol at Tom's chest. "I have orders to shoot to kill." The security officer has orders to shoot to kill people who are trying to go to work? People who already have clearance to see the data he's trying to protect? Tom declares that he's going into his office to call Whitney's family and let them know she's dead, which seems like something he could have done from the outside using his cell phone, except that Chad's characters almost never have cell phones. It's odd. Once in a while he'll mention one, like when he said that Marie wasn't attached to hers anymore, but often he's just oblivious to their existence and to how they've changed society. Based on the trial data, that changed at some point. Anyway, the guard says his orders are to keep everyone out. For some reason, Tom wouldn't drop the subject. He argued long enough that 3 of the 5 guards were soon screaming obscenities in his face. For what reason? Whatever reason. As usual, Chad hasn't thought through his character's motivations, so their actions don't make sense. "Get out of here," the spirit whispered to Aaron, and he quickly backed away down the road as most of the crowd surged forward to support Tom. Within seconds, Aaron heard several shots fired, and all he could see was a flailing mass of humanity as the guards were overpowered and beaten by the workers. I'm not really clear on how these unarmed office workers overcame 5 armed security guards, but I guess they really wanted band-aids. This phrase, mass of humanity, makes me think of a similar phrase Chad used in Doug's Dilemma, a clog of humanity. I don't know if he knows what humanity means. Aaron runs back the way he came, sits on the side of the road, and cries. He was sickened by the actions of his co-workers. Only an hour earlier, they had been upstanding citizens on their way to work. Now, after the earthquake, they had already exhibited signs of savagery and a mob mentality. He was sure Tom and several others had been shot to death, and the guards probably hadn't survived either. Ah, yes, the good old Chad standby. Suddenly everyone turned evil. That's how reality works in the Chad Daybell Doomsday universe. Some tiny thing can turn a person good or evil, even though there's no reason why that thing would have any bearing on the state of their immortal soul. The earthquake turned Aaron's co-workers evil. I don't know why, but that's what happened. Maybe an asteroid strike will turn them good again. Maybe not. After bawling his eyes out for a while, Aaron uses a rock to break a car window so that he can grab a piece of the broken glass. Pretty sure car windows are made of safety glass, but whatever. "Mr. President, please accept my resignation," he said solemnly as he sliced open the back of his hand. He then used the glass to dig out his chip. He let his hand bleed as he held the chip and looked closely at it. "Oh, what fools we've been," he said. "Our freedoms are gone, and we're being led like sheep to the slaughter." By whom? The earthquake? This is very dramatic. Thus ends chapter 16. Carol and Denise are still walking to the white camp. I don't know how many days they've been walking now, and Chad doesn't tell us. The following chapters are marred by a fault of Chad's that's increasingly causing me difficulty as I try to understand what's happening, and that's his refusal to write any geographical explanations for what's going on. He's certain we're all intimately familiar with the geography of Utah, and it makes the action impossible to follow. I shouldn't have to use Google Maps to figure it out. But I did. Here's a map. If I understand correctly, Carol and Denise have walked from Orem, probably along 189, to the Deer Creek Reservoir on their way to Heber. The map says Heber City, but Chad always says Heber. I think they're the same place. Carol and Denise are still on the highway when the earthquake hits. They both instinctively ducked as the cliff they had just walked beneath collapsed and buried the highway less than 100 yards behind them. Dust filled the air from other smaller landslides, and the water in the reservoir continued to slosh violently. They run to an open area, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me because they're in the mountains, but that's what they do. They're at the Deer Creek Reservoir Dam, which is here. Now, somehow, they're able to see Heber, which is here, from their position. Maybe that's possible? I don't know. If anybody watching is from Utah, let me know in the comments. I'm very curious now. Carol turned toward Heber, and it took her a moment to comprehend what she was seeing. A blue-green wall of water was coming out of the canyon north of the city. "Holy smokes!" Carol cried. She grabbed Denise's hand and started running up a nearby hillside. She glanced back every few seconds, and each time she did, the water had grown closer and seemingly deeper. Heber had been completely engulfed. There were cars, yard items, and even parts of houses being tossed around at the front of the churning deluge. So the idea is that this reservoir up here has overflowed because of the earthquake and sent a small tsunami all the way through Heber and into Deer Creek Reservoir down here. Is that possible? I have no idea. I guess you'd have to ask Tom Harrison, since Chad admits he got the details of the earthquake from Visions of Glory. Carol and Denise stop running long enough to pray for everyone who's going to endure the floods, then keep hiking toward the white camp. Thus ends chapter 17. Somehow, by this time, Aaron is over by Camp Williams, which is about 20 miles from Orem, and I don't know if that's where the NSA is or if he walked there. I don't even know that there's really an NSA office in Utah. I don't know where they do their work. Chad writes that from where he is, Aaron can see Utah State Prison, which has since been named Utah Department of Corrections, and that beyond it, a giant sinkhole has opened up in the middle of Salt Lake City. He got the sinkhole from Visions of Glory. Here's a rough map. Here's Carol and Denise, and you can see the water flowing down from the Jordanelle Reservoir, through Heber, through the mountains, and through Provo Canyon. Then on the left is Aaron, who's standing right on the edge of this enormous hole. Aaron impulsively started running toward the hole, which was about 2 miles away but seemed much closer. He steered clear of the prison, where 3 buildings were in flames, and he could hear cursing and screaming. It sounded like the prisoners were taking matters into their own hands. He finally reached the edge of the hole, and he reeled back in shock at the enormity of the destruction. The sheer size of the hole boggled Aaron's mind. It was several miles wide. Thousands of homes and businesses had just sunk into the earth, including any citizens that happened to be there. The hole was partially filled with water that appeared to be rising. A man rides up on a 4-wheeler. His name is Dale. He's LDS, and he's brought rappelling equipment in case there's any chance the people in the hole can be saved, but he and Aaron agree that no one survived. Dale theorizes that there was a giant lake beneath the city, and the dome over top of it collapsed during the earthquake. I kind of feel like that's something they would have noticed in Salt Lake. Maybe not when they first settled there, but eventually. Especially with all this concern about earthquakes. But no one knew it was there. Dale's family heeded the prophet's invitation to gather to the mountains, but Dale was too stubborn and is now getting humbled. He's going to check on his sister, who's probably also getting humbled, and offers to give Aaron a ride since Aaron is trying to get to Temple Square to tell the general authorities something. When they pull up to Dale's sister Kathy's house, things aren't looking good. "That's Kathy's house over there," Dale said. They drove closer, and a middle-aged woman standing on the lawn spotted them. She threw her hands in the air and ran toward them in a panic. "Oh, Dale, I hoped you'd come," she cried as they got off the four-wheeler. "Heidi is trapped in the basement. We can talk to her, but she says the water's getting higher." Dale hurried over to the side of the house where several people were standing around anxiously. The house had collapsed on itself, and Aaron could see the face of a young girl peering up at them through what was once a window well. "Uncle Dale, help me!" Should I reread that? Was that too silly? I don't know. She probably didn't sound like that. Dale asks Aaron if he'll go inside the house with him, and Aaron very dramatically says that he will, and they go inside. The basement to the stairwell is already filling with water. Dale rushed down the stairs and climbed into the water. There was barely enough clearance in the hallway for him to breathe, but they could hear Heidi's screams. "Dale, this is crazy," Aaron said. "By the time you get back, this hallway's going to be filled. You'll never make it out." Dale grimaced, knowing Aaron was right, but he said, "I'd never be able to live with myself if I didn't try. Pray for me." Before Aaron could even react, Dale took a deep breath and plunged into the flooded hallway. Aaron stood in shock, knowing there would likely be 2 drownings in the next couple of minutes. Heidi, and then Dale in a vain rescue attempt. Could it really be their time to die? Honestly, I can relate to Dale in this scene. If it were my niece in a flooding basement, I'd make the same choice. When he says he wouldn't be able to live with himself if he didn't try, I think most of us know exactly what he means. But as I read this, I can't help thinking about Chad's crimes against children. What happened between the time he wrote this and the time he killed Tylee and JJ? Is he saying he died trying to save a child, but he won't put up with having to provide day-to-day care for one? I actually think that's probably true. One of the driving forces behind all this doomsday prepping seems to be a deep desire for excitement. And not just for Chad, but for everyone involved in this subculture. If you watched Hidden True Crime's interview with Laurie's cousin Braxton, who's a big-time prepper, he talked about kind of hoping the end would come, so he could put all his plans into action and see if they work and eat the 7,000 pounds of wheat flour in his garage or whatever. Something in Chad changed between the writing of Standing in Holy Places and Times of Turmoil. His fantasy changed from being focused on the return of Jesus and the end of the telestial world to being focused on excitement and battles and tragedies. It's like he got bored with his life. Of course, he's never going to let go of that religious fantasy. As panic seized his heart, Aaron put both hands in the swirling water and said, "By the power of the Melchizedek priesthood I hold, and in the name of Jesus Christ, I command this water to depart this basement." It sounded ludicrous even as he said it, but within 2 seconds of his command, the western wall of the basement cracked. Water began gushing into a 6-inch wide gap, and the water level began to noticeably drop. Soon there was nearly a foot of clearance in the hallway. Dale saves Heidi, and they have a big cookout to celebrate and to eat all the stuff in the fridge that's going to go bad. Aaron decides to spend the night on a couch in Kathy's backyard. Thus ends chapter 18. I'm going to have to stop reading quite so enthusiastically. I seem to be losing my voice. I have pulled up my mic so that hopefully you can still hear me with no problem, but I'm definitely starting to get really scratchy, and I'm really hoping I'm not getting sick because tomorrow is the 25th anniversary of my cancer diagnosis. I was a teenager, and I'm going out to dinner with my mom and Gosha, and I really, really don't want to be sick. Although it would be pretty ironic to get sick on the 25th anniversary of your cancer diagnosis. Anyway, chapter 19. Garrett Foster walked through Los Angeles City Hall and headed toward his private room that same evening. He had spent a long day at the Rose Bowl evaluating the citizens who were detained there. Garrett felt empty inside after helping determine the fate of fellow U.S. citizens. Some would essentially become slaves to the UN to help rebuild society, while the rest, who didn't measure up, would be, well, he didn't like to think about their future. This pretty much lets us know that Garrett is well aware of what he's taking part in. Also, this is at least the third time that Chad has talked about people living in a city hall. The false prophet Sherem in Standing in Holy Places lived in Salt Lake City Hall. His stepson Mo, which stood for Mighty One, was living in the Lincoln Point City Hall and escaped to Zion. And now Garrett is living in LA's City Hall. Why does Chad think people live in city halls? I'm very curious to know why he thinks this is a thing. It's not like they have bedrooms. Garrett is about to settle in for the night when he hears about the earthquake in Salt Lake, and he takes a moment to scoff at one of the UN peacekeepers' accents on his way to his big emergency meeting. A Russian leader known as Commander Klopov stood before them. He had treated Garrett with respect ever since the success of the voice message. He was also one of the few foreign leaders who spoke English quite well. I got news for you, Chad. The last time I was in Romania, which was about 20 years ago, the bellhop at my hotel spoke better English than I did. English is one of the 6 official languages of the UN, by the way. It's little things like this that have me convinced that even if Chad had never met Lori, never founded a cult, never killed anyone, he'd still be a xenophobic jerk. Klopov is going to take a bunch of UN troops to Salt Lake under the guise of helping with disaster relief after the earthquake, but with the secret intention of putting the UN infrastructure in place, which I assume is code for Chad having no idea how military strategy works. Garrett is elevated to battalion leader because he's the only one who's ever been to Utah before. And as far as I can tell, no one with the UN has maps. This is Klopov speaking, and if you thought my voice for Heidi was ridiculous, wait until you hear my Russian accent. Aren't Hoover Dam and Las Vegas between here and Utah? We've been asked to secure those areas as well. Yes, Garrett said. We can do that on the way. Klopov smiled. It looks like we've found our battalion leader. Right. Garrett has been promoted from guy who operates the chip detector to battalion leader because he once spent the weekend in Vegas. Makes total sense. Now that Garrett's a battalion leader, General Klopov wants to make sure he's loyal. There is one matter of business to finalize with you, though. Your loyalty. What do you mean? Garrett asked. I've already told you I'm committed to rebuilding the nation. Klopov smiled faintly. Yes, but who are we rebuilding the nation for? Garrett was confused for a moment. Then it all became clear. As he had already suspected, the acts of humanitarian kindness by the UN forces had deeper purposes. America is essentially dead, Klopov continued. The United States will never return. Over the years, your leaders unwittingly paved the way for a group of nations known as the Coalition to divide up America among themselves. Garrett felt sick to his stomach. That's not true. The American people will never allow it to happen. They'll fight back. So is it not true, or is it just that Americans will fight back? Which? Garrett is shocked to learn that the UN isn't really there to help, which he definitely already knew. Also, they've definitely used the term coalition with him before this scene, and yet Klopov talks about it like it's a brand new idea to Garrett. Garrett thinks things over for a minute and decides to swear fealty to the coalition, this organization that he learned existed just 3 paragraphs ago, so he's definitely completely sincere. Then he feels a darkness creeping into his soul and goes back to whatever council chamber or rotunda he's been given as his bedroom. Then the truth hit him hard. The oath was basically a counterfeit version of promises he had made in the temples of the LDS Church. He had been excommunicated from the church several years earlier for having an extramarital affair with Vanessa, but deep down he had still hoped to fulfill those promises someday. Had he just sold his soul? Chad lacks perspective. There are no LDS temples in Russia or China, most of Asia, in fact, and I think only like a dozen in Europe. It's unfathomable that a group of Russian, Chinese, and intermittently Middle Eastern leaders decided to write a loyalty oath for their secret coalition, and one of them said, "Hey, Let's make it a parody of LDS temple oaths. Thus ends chapter 19. They were now back on Nauvoo's temple square, and Nathan offered to help weed some flower beds with several other men. Society is collapsing, the end times are upon us, but Nathan and Marie have gone to Nauvoo because they need help weeding the flower beds. While Nathan is distracted by his gardening, Marie goes to speak with the temple president. Marie smiled, suddenly unsure of herself. Can maintenance missionaries ever get married? President Golding kept a straight face. Why? Do you have someone in mind? Good one, Chad. Luckily, President Golding received a text message from God that morning. I saw you two walking together this morning, and a voice said to me, "It is their time." I didn't get told what it was time for, but I think you've helped provide the answer. Is that why you were praying? Marie asked. Yes. I don't want to interfere or be a meddling matchmaker, but the Spirit has confirmed to me that if you two choose to get married now, it would be all right. Don't you agree? So the rules are sacrosanct, but God occasionally authorizes exceptions. I find this a concerning precedent, given what Chad will later claim God told him it was all right for him to do. Marie declares that she can't ask Nathan to marry her, even though God has given them personal permission to get married. So then President Golding has to manipulate Nathan into thinking it was all his idea. Nathan nodded and walked to where Marie still stood near the statues. Hey, Marie, do you have a second I could talk to you? She gazed into his eyes. I suppose. Yeah, that sounds like a woman who's excited to get engaged. Nathan got down on one knee. I'm hoping this won't come as a surprise to you, but will you marry me? If you ever propose to someone of any gender, any religion, don't begin with, I hope this doesn't come as a surprise. It's a filler statement. It doesn't really mean anything or have any significance. Your chances of getting a yes are much better if you replace it with a compliment. Or even better than that, a string of compliments explaining why you want to spend your life with the person you're asking. Nathan declares that they should get married that day, though, so they do. Marie doesn't have her temple endowment yet, and I think that ritual lasts 2 or 3 hours. Also, my understanding is that part of the endowment session involves watching a film reenactment of some of the stories from Genesis, but the temple doesn't have power. So I'm assuming they pulled out the old scripts and dressed up and put the thing on like a play, like in the early days of the church probably happened. It's pretty convenient that all of these temple guards have been practicing the play, just hoping somebody will come by and need their endowment. I wonder which one of the guys played Eve. One of the temple guards just so happens to also be the county clerk. So he runs down to the office to get a marriage certificate because I don't really know why. According to the last chapter, America is over. It seems like a temple ceiling would be enough, but Chad likes to get caught up in the weeds. Prime example, he spends a page and a half giving us the details of Marie's temple recommend interview with President Golding. I'm a full tithe payer because I haven't earned a dime in months, she said. The funny thing is, I never actually got paid for my internship. They covered my living and food expenses, and then they were going to pay me a lump sum once I was finished. Marie paused and wiped her eyes. I never sowed my wild oats or anything like that, but I've made some choices that weren't wise, although they seemed right at the time. I was too focused on finishing my education and starting a career. They paid her in francs and beans? That's how you get out of paying taxes. Luckily, Nathan still has his own temple recommend in his pocket, so we don't have to go through a page and a half of him talking about this. Now that Marie has received her endowment and condemned her career aspirations, she and Nathan are able to get sealed for time and all eternity in one of the sealing rooms. After which, this happens. Marie's eyes lit up as one of the women stepped toward them with a container that held a display of various rings and said, When the economy started falling apart, the local jeweler grabbed his best items and left town, but he forgot a cabinet full of rings in the back room. So everyone's worried about getting Marie her endowment and making sure that Nathan has a temple recommend and filling out the proper paperwork with the county clerk. But in the midst of that, one of the temple guards' wives has looted a local jewelry shop? Am I the only one who sees a contradiction here? Finally, President Golding had been silent throughout the ring selection, and now, to everyone's surprise, he stepped forward and gave Nathan a big embrace. He stepped back and said in a husky voice, "I apologize for that awkward hug, but that is from your mother, Helen. She is with us today and wanted me to tell you she loves you both. She says you make a beautiful couple." I'm betting President Golding played Eve. They're given the honeymoon suite in Hotel Nauvoo. The next morning, Nathan and Marie were startled awake by a knock on their hotel door. Nathan jumped up and pulled his clothes on, while Marie hid under the covers. Nathan opened the door to find President Golding standing there sheepishly. That is the closest I ever need to get to a love scene written by Chad Daybell. President Golding has woken them up because he's received news of the earthquake in Salt Lake. Exactly how he received this news isn't clear. He's also gotten a note from Elder Miller ordering all maintenance missionaries to report to the bishop's storehouse and authorizing the missionaries to use cars, which I hadn't realized they weren't supposed to be doing, because Nathan and Marie have definitely been using cars whenever possible. President Golding gives Nathan the keys to a pickup truck and $300 in cash, and Nathan and Marie head back toward Utah. Thus ends chapter 20. I have no idea how much time has passed at this point, but Carol and Denise still haven't made it to the fancy white camp and are sleeping rough somewhere in the Wasatch Mountains. They hiked along the hills south of the reservoir, and within a couple of hours they saw a paved road that seemed to magically emerge from the mud. "I think this leads to a town called Walsburg, tucked away behind those hills," Carol said. Here's the thing. They were at the dam when the earthquake hit. They're trying to get to Camas up here. But for some reason, they've been traveling southeast instead of northeast and ended up near the crappy blue camp in Walsburg. As they get close, they're accosted by two armed men who, by pure coincidence, have been staying at the crappy blue Walsburg camp. "Are you part of the Walsburg camp?" Carol asked. "Yes, we're guarding this road," the younger man said. "Sorry, but we aren't letting anyone in right now. The camp is nearly out of food." So they're running out of food, but Denise says she's really hungry and then gives them puppy dog eyes. So they decide to take Carol and Denise in anyway. The men are named Jeb and Stu, which is spelled like the soup. Stu kept looking at them and finally blurted out, "You're not mother and daughter, are you?" What a sensitive, classy way to demand to know why Carol is Caucasian and Denise is half Hispanic. Jeb explains that there are about 300 people in the camp, but some have recently left due to the food situation. Then he says it's time for lunch. They eat lunch, and Chad writes, 30 minutes later, Carol and Denise had full stomachs. Are they running out of food or not? Does Chad keep forgetting that they're running out of food? Why aren't they rationing it? Their stomachs shouldn't be full. You don't need a full stomach to survive. It's just strange. Then Chad writes a variation of a scene he's written many times before. Someone arrives somewhere, and everyone sits down around them and listens to them talk about where they've been. Is this common in the LDS community? Or is this just a way of fulfilling Chad's need for attention? He wrote the same scene in Standing in Holy Places. He's doing it here. He's going to do it again in the next book. I think it's just a scene he enjoys imagining. Carol describes everything she and Denise have been through during however long they've been hiking, and finishes her talk by telling the campers that they should be glad they're here and not in Orem, where there's terrible gang violence. I mean, we never heard about that, but apparently there was terrible gang violence. A woman called out, "Then what should we do? Within 2 weeks, we'll be out of food." "We need to put our trust in God," Denise suddenly said. "He'll help us if we rely on him." "Denise is right," Carol said. "We need to pray for help. I don't care if you're Mormon, Catholic, or Baptist. We need to kneel down and ask our Heavenly Father to guide us in our actions and to ask Him to send us food." "Amen," Jeb said loudly, but the people first looked skeptical. They had been hoping for a more practical solution. I bet they had. At this point, I've read a few Chad Daybell novels. Just a couple. And I took it for granted when I read this scene that God would reward the people's faith and send them an edible miracle. No. Doesn't happen. I guess Elder Miller was right when he said that the Spirit of the Lord wasn't with the people in the crappy blue camps, because these people get abandoned to starve or eat each other or eat the trees. I don't know the details, but I know it doesn't look good. Thus ends chapter 21. The next morning, as Denise and Carol began their first full day helping to better organize the Wallsburg camp, Aaron was in downtown Salt Lake. What? The camp doesn't need to be organized. It needs to be resupplied. It's not that they can't find their food. It's that they don't have any food. Aaron, on the other hand, has helped Dale, Kathy, and presumably little Heidi polish off whatever else was in their fridge. He says his goodbyes and begins walking toward Temple Square, but it's flooded, so he walks to the home of Elder Bushman, who's the general authority he's been reporting to regarding what's going on at the NSA. They share some cookies and talk about how soon it will be time for the people in the white camps to leave their camps and join together in larger groups. Chad had them do the same thing in Standing in Holy Places, and it didn't make any more sense then than it does now. The church spent years preparing and stocking these camps, and then the faithful people who enter them are there for, 4 months tops? Before the church says, now you've got to move again. Now you have to join up with this group and camp on the grounds outside the temples, and then you're going to have to pack up again and walk to Missouri, and somewhere along the way, you're going to have to learn how to change things into handcarts. I'm so sick of hearing about these stupid camps. I wanted to read about God and Doomsday and Jesus returning, and instead, I feel like I'm cosplaying as the administrator of a state park. Elder Bushman says, "We've had reports that some camps are starting to run out of food, and there's been some violent clashes within the camps as well." "That's crazy," Aaron said. "Is it really so hard for people to just get along?" Yes. When it comes to feeding their children, yes, people will fight tooth and nail. Not Chad. Other people. Then Elder Bushman replies, and this knocked me over. "Apparently so, but those camps will be formally disbanded as soon as possible. People can continue living at the camps if they want, but they'll be encouraged to return to the valleys and help with the rebuilding process. We think most of them will take that option." "I agree," Aaron said. "It sounds like they're suffering from cabin fever." Why did they spend years preparing these camps and berating people about going to them or not going to them if they're going to disband the camps and tell everyone to go home 4 months later? I almost want to go back to the Great Gathering and read that bonkers scene where Tad and Doug fight about gathering to the mountains, and Doug's like, "No, I wouldn't mind if the bank repossessed my house while I was in the mountains because it would be their legal right to do so." And Tad's like, "I think you've got a screw loose." And Emma looks at Doug like, "I don't know what's wrong with him." And what's wrong with Aaron here? The people in the camps who are killing each other for food so their small children can survive have cabin fever? Elder Bushman says that the majority of the people in the camps are LDS. Not anymore. Not after you jerked him around like this. Then Aaron tells Elder Bushman that the last thing he learned at the NSA was that the UN was moving troops from LA to Vegas. Since their leaders love to take over disaster zones, they've probably already added Salt Lake as a must-see destination. Yes, Chad. UN peacekeepers assist in disaster zones. I'm glad you finally read the Wikipedia article. Thus ends chapter 22. Nathan and Marie drive back toward Utah and discuss scriptures after finding a Book of Mormon under the seat. The truck must have previously belonged to Josh Brown. They're constantly driving past scenes of horrific violence and massive losses of life, but they dismiss it as a necessary cleansing of the land. In less than 2 pages, they make it from Nauvoo to Utah, and they're shocked to learn that Heber was washed away in a flood. Kind of makes me wonder if Chad hates Heber. A family standing on the side of the road tells them what happened and gives them directions to the Walsburg camp, and Nathan and Marie drive off. I don't know if they've decided to leave this family to fend for themselves or if the family abandoned the Walsburg camp because they've run out of food. All I know is they don't offer anybody a ride. They reach the Walsburg camp the next day, and it doesn't seem like the camp is even hidden. It seems to be right there in town among the buildings, which begs the question, why did people from Walsburg need to leave their homes? A bunch of men are walking around with weapons, so Nathan decides to treat the situation like humanity's first interaction with alien life. They got out of the truck and walked slowly toward the group. "We come in peace," Nathan called out. "We are only seeking to find a way to Utah Valley." As they got closer, one of the women said, "Hey, aren't you Elder Foster, the missionary who led us here in the first place?" Nathan looked closely at the woman and recognized her as the lady he had talked to at the Provo Temple gate before leading her group to Walsburg. I don't generally advocate for violence, even fictional violence, but it would have been so funny if that woman had punched Nathan right in the face at that moment. He and Marie explained that they just need directions to Orem, which I feel like they could have probably gotten from that family they abandoned on the side of the road. And Jeb, or Stu, says, "Oh, we just had a lady and a kid from Orem show up a few days ago. They're over in that tent." Nathan says he'll go talk to them. Marie stepped forward. "Let me do it. They might respond better to a feminine voice." She pulled the tent flap aside and then let out a scream. The 2 people in the tent had seen her and screamed as well. Then Marie dived into the tent, and Nathan stood outside in shock. "Marie, what's going on?" he asked nervously. You know, I'm starting to think Nathan isn't the guy I want by my side in an emergency. There's a happy reunion and lots more screaming as Nathan and Denise and Carol and Marie celebrate that they're all alive. Carol instinctively clutched Marie's hand and felt a ring. "What's this?" she asked in surprise. "Are you 2 engaged?" Nathan smiled mischievously. "Even better. We're married." Carol stopped in her tracks with her mouth open, unsure to be happy or outraged. "Mom, we got sealed in the Nauvoo temple," Marie said. "Everything is wonderful." Carol couldn't contain herself and threw her arms around them both, and Denise joined in the group hug. I originally marked this passage to discuss because I wanted to throw Chad a bone. I was going to say that "Mom, we got sealed in the Nauvoo temple" was probably the most realistic line of dialogue Chad has ever written, because I can completely see a young woman being excited to tell her mom that. The Nauvoo temple is historic, I'm sure it's very beautiful, and I liked that this was the first thing that Marie blurted out to her mom. It felt really genuine to me. Until I reread the sentence before it, which is missing the word "weather," but I'll insert it when I read it here. Carol stopped in her tracks with her mouth open, unsure whether to be happy or outraged. I reread it, and that's when I realized that Marie isn't dishing about her favorite wedding memories. She's reassuring her mom that she and Nathan aren't just shacking up. And after that, it really lost its charm. This ends chapter 23. Chad began this book by apologizing for the cliffhanger ending, but I don't think he really minded the attention he got because he attempts another one here. It's harder to care about Garrett, though, because he has no soul. He's riding into Nevada with the UN, wondering if he made a mistake by pledging all he had to General Klopoff. He finally rationalized that he hadn't denied the existence of God or done anything that might jeopardize his eternal welfare. He had simply committed to devote all his time, talents, and resources to the coalition. "It's a man-made organization and will someday fall," he told himself. "I'm only doing this to reach my children." Keep telling yourself that, bud. The next morning, as Garrett left his room and entered the hotel lobby, he saw several people crowded around the TV. He stepped closer and saw the words, "Oil freeze," across the bottom of the screen. Frankly, ending the first book with Marie and Nathan stranded in downtown Chicago while the city burned was a lot more suspenseful than Garrett finding out the U.S. isn't going to be receiving any more oil. In fact, the only person who can muster any excitement is General Klopoff. Klopoff laughed. Americans are so foolish. They actually think we want to help them. We're not here to save America. We're here to take control of America. This is the first step. I think even Chad was disappointed by this ending, which is likely why he decided to conclude with a wild compliment to Utens. He stood up and put his hand on Garrett's shoulder. All of our intelligence reports say there's one place that will oppose us more than anywhere else. Any guesses where that is? Utah. Correct, Klopoff said with a grin. Your home. The earthquake there has left them vulnerable, and you're going to lead us right into the heart of Salt Lake, so we can rip it out. Thus ends chapter 24. Chad then adds one of his weird, here's what happened in the 3 months after the book ended things, even though there are 2 more books in this series in which he could share that stuff. The most noticeable thing about this section is how repetitive and predictable the events described are. Like, what happens after the oil embargo? The same thing that happens after every national event. Riots and violent protests and gang warfare. Society descends into chaos. Father against son and mother against daughter, and the Constitution hanging by a thread. The only unexpected part is this bit, and I really should have seen it coming. America faced a serious problem. Most of the nation's armed forces were overseas fighting other people's battles. Very few troops were available on U.S. soil to help quell the violence, or heaven forbid, to defend the country against an attack from a foreign power. I was going to end with that, but I can't resist reading this. America was at a boiling point, and the pot was about to boil over. I don't have anything deep to say about it. I just think it's one of the worst sentences I've ever read. Thus ends martial law. But not the physical, printed object of the book, because Chad then includes a brief note from himself, followed by an excerpt from Suzanne Freeman's book, The Spirit of Liberty, which had just come out. And what a coincidence, Chad published it. Of course he did. He doesn't mention that. I'd like to turn now to discussing how this book could have been improved. My first thought is simply that I wish Chad would learn how to express the passage of time in writing. Usually when I talk about specific craft issues, I try to acknowledge that some things are really hard. But this isn't. All you have to do is throw in a week later and the summer sun was setting. It's very easy and takes almost no time. It's just a matter of getting into the habit of doing it. This really isn't Chad's worst book, not by a long shot. Does it have a plot structure? Not really. Do the characters have clear, compelling goals and emotionally relatable motivations? Not at all. But at least things happen, unlike in his next book, which is mostly just people traveling around Utah. It's like that one really weak section in the Fellowship of the Ring when they're trying to get to Moria and they're hiking through the pass of Karathros for like 40 pages in the snow. Actually, it's a lot like that. I wonder if Chad ever read Lord of the Rings. He probably just saw the movies. Anyway, back to how to fix this book. Also, I don't think I understood that scene in Karathros when I read it because I didn't know what was going to happen down in the mines in Moria. One thing I would love to see Chad work on is his side characters. They are interchangeable. Their names are their only differences. Well, and Pastor Haskell is black, as we heard 85 times. That's actually the one feature of a side character in this entire book that he felt was worth pointing out. I'm out of energy to feel outraged. I'm sure that in his mind, each of his characters is a unique and precious snowflake. But to the naked eye, snowflakes all look the same. Except Pastor Haskell. I just keep walking into it. President Golding and Elder Bushman and Elder Miller and Tom and Dale and Jeb and Stu, they're all exactly the same. Even the family standing on the side of the road. Chad needs to add a little color. This is just grim at this point. Don't add any color, Chad. Don't even try. He needs to give his side characters more personality. That's my point. Let's move on. What have we learned about Chad? Well, we've learned that he was still a racist in 2013. No real surprise there. We've learned he probably wanted to visit Nauvoo, but never did, based on his descriptions of it. Most importantly, we've learned that something changed in Chad between when he finished writing Standing in Holy Places and began writing Times of Turmoil. Or maybe even earlier. His priorities changed. Whereas before he was happy to write chapter after chapter of good church members being obedient, now he's fantasizing about action and excitement. He wants escapes and close calls and four-wheelers and natural disasters. This series has a completely different feeling than his last. What changed? And when? I see two major possibilities. The first is simply that a lot of small, unremarkable things happened. Everyone changes over time. I mean, anyone who's been in a long-term relationship knows that you and your partner aren't the same person on your 10th anniversary as you were on your first. That's life. Chad was sort of locked into the tone of each series as soon as he wrote the first book, so what we're really talking about is the period between 2007 and 2012. A lot happened to Chad during that time. His publishing company failed, he had to go back to working in the cemetery, he and Tammy had to file for bankruptcy, and they celebrated their 20-year anniversary. Plus, Chad turned 40. A lot of people have wondered if all of this was some kind of midlife crisis. Yeah, I think that's for sure a component. And this seems like the most likely possibility. Like, he turned 40 and he wished his life was different, so he started fantasizing about something else. The other possibility is that something happened. Something changed him. I don't know what. I couldn't find anything major in his autobiography or his old blog. Except that he did say that the period after Spring Creek Books went under was the most challenging period of his marriage. There might have been something there. I just wonder if something happened, because I keep remembering this interview from an old episode of Mayday. This young woman had been on a ferry, I think it was in the Mediterranean, and the ferry sank. It was just a horrible thing. And she said in her interview that something she'd had to come to terms with in therapy afterward was that she had never felt more alive than she did during those hours when the boat was going down and she was trying to survive. That stuck with me. And I wonder, if a person didn't get therapy after an event like that, would they try to recreate that feeling instead? I don't know. I'm just spitballing at this point. As far as I know, Chad Daybell didn't even stub his toe between 2007 and 2012. But it seems clear that whether it happened gradually or in response to a particular event, something changed in Chad during this time period. Something made him crave adventure, and it put him on the path to, well, where he is now. That is all I have for you this week. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. Please join me next week when Chad will take us on a personal four-wheeler tour of the Utah backcountry. I will continue to voice General Klopoff like he's a villain from Archer, and Marie will do that thing that Chad's female characters do. You can probably guess what it is. As a reminder, please don't reach out to anyone involved in this case, and please remember to use your words wisely. Thanks. President Golden kept a straight face. Why? Do you have someone in mind? I'm sure you didn't. I gotta that was probably not how Chad meant for me to read that. Well, Chad didn't mean for me to read any of this.